Welcome back, I'm Nathan Cole. Airport dangers aren't just mid-air disasters. The most terrifying spots are the ones you pass daily. From a baggage handler vanishing beneath a busy terminal to a cargo worker locked inside the aircraft and nobody realized he was on. It was March 14th, 2015, at an airport in Atlanta, Georgia. Above ground, passengers waited for delayed flights and watched luggage circle baggage claim. Beneath the terminal, conveyor belts ran through narrow service tunnels. And that day, a 51-year-old guy named Hollis Jacobs clocked into work down there. Hollis was a veteran. 24 years on the job. He was just a regular guy who kept his head down, drove an old truck, and had a picture of his beagle, Rusty, taped inside his locker. According to the reports, he'd been divorced for a while, didn't see his kids much, and spent his weekends fishing alone. He wasn't a boss, and passengers never saw him, but he was the guy who kept the place moving. That night, Hollis was assigned to Bay 7. A guide rail was acting up and jamming bags, which was a known issue that week. Workers had already cleared several temporary blockages during previous shifts, and most only required a quick adjustment before operations resumed. The fix itself wasn't complicated, but the setup was dangerous. Right below the rail was a massive drive roller, a classic pinch point where the heavy belt met the metal frame. If anything got caught in there, it wasn't going to stop. Here's where things went wrong. Hollis was supposed to use a lockout padlock to completely kill the power to the belt before working on it. It's safety 101. He actually signed out the lock, but according to the reports, he never used it. Maybe he was in a hurry, or maybe he thought the job would only take 2 seconds. Investigators later found the lock sitting right there in his jacket pocket. At 11:41 that night, Hollis radioed that he was checking under the housing. The jam had already cleared, and bags were moving normally again. According to investigators, supervisors believed Hollis was only performing a quick inspection to confirm the guide rail was aligned properly before the system returned to full operation. A few minutes later, another minor backup began forming upstream. With flights still arriving and luggage starting to stack up, a supervisor monitoring the control screens believed the repair work was finished and authorized the belt network to resume normal speed. Nobody actually checked to confirm Hollis had exited the tunnel or removed himself from the machinery. The second the power kicked back on, tragedy hit. Hollis was crouched right next to that roller, and his heavy jacket sleeve got sucked in. It pulled his right arm forward instantly. Looking at the scene later, investigators found scrape marks where Hollis desperately braced himself with his left hand, trying to fight the machine and pull away. But you can't outmuscle industrial machinery. The roller dragged his arm in deeper, fracturing and dislocating his shoulder, and slammed his chest hard against the steel frame. He didn't get pulled all the way through. Instead, he got wedged tightly between the roller and the metal housing. For me, this is the worst part of the case. The jam wasn't big enough to trigger an automatic shutdown. The belts just kept grinding away around him. Down there, the noise is deafening. Another worker thought they heard a weird mechanical thud, but shrugged it off as a heavy suitcase hitting a rail. Right above Hollis's head, oblivious passengers were grabbing their bags from Carousel 7 while he was trapped in the dark underneath them. By 5:10 a.m., the next shift realized Hollis never signed out. They found him a few minutes later, but it was far too late. The medical examiner said he died from traumatic crush injuries and asphyxia. Essentially, the machine pinned his chest so hard he couldn't breathe, and he bled out. Those bruises on his left hand showed he fought like hell until the very end. In the end, OSHA cited the contractor for safety violations, but no one faced criminal charges. For reasons never fully explained, the case never went public, and the company quietly paid out a settlement to Hollis's family. A week later, maintenance finally replaced that faulty guide rail. It took them less than an hour. When they cleaned out Hollis's locker, his padlock was still in his coat. It's a brutal reminder of how a single skipped safety step can cost everything. I thought Hollis's story was hard to beat, but the next case proves that sometimes the most dangerous place in an airport isn't underneath it. It's a place most passengers think is completely safe. It's August 9th, 2016, at an airport in Manila. Flights were running behind schedule, and Gate 12 was in the middle of a tight turnaround, leaving the staff distracted and rushing between tasks. Enter Crisanto Belen, who was 67, and to his family, he was just Chris. He wasn't a frequent flyer. In fact, he'd spent 30 years behind a desk in Tarlac handling paperwork. He was a meticulous, quiet guy who hated making mistakes. He was flying to Cebu for his brother's 70th birthday, only his second time ever on a plane. In his bag were a few gifts and his daily asthma inhaler. Boarding for his flight started around 7:15 p.m. Chris scanned his pass and walked down the jet bridge. But right at the plane door, he panicked. He thought he lost his inhaler. Now, if you don't have asthma, that might seem like a minor thing, but for someone who relies on it to breathe, realizing it's missing is an instant, terrifying emergency. Naturally, he turned around and walked back up the jet bridge to check his bag. The crew saw him leave, but they just assumed he'd be right back. Honestly, that's where the first domino fell. Nobody bothered to check why an elderly man was walking backwards against the flow of traffic. By the time Chris found his inhaler tucked safely inside his bag, the boarding was totally done. And this is where the system completely failed him. The investigation report showed that the ground crew thought the flight attendants checked the bridge. The flight attendants thought the ground crew did it. It was a classic case of everyone assuming it was someone else's job, so nobody actually walked the bridge. At 7:27 p.m., the jet bridge pulled away from the plane. The terminal doors locked automatically. Chris was trapped in the middle. Through the glass, he watched his plane back away. And to make matters worse, his inhaler was almost empty. At 7:34 p.m., he hit the emergency intercom. Nothing. It turns out that the intercom had been broken for 11 days and nobody bothered to fix it. He started banging on the doors, but the gate area was already a ghost town. The staff had moved on to the next flight. Security footage from the bridge is actually heartbreaking to watch for me. He's pacing, looking out the windows, desperately trying to get the attention of anyone on the tarmac. The air in that enclosed bridge is thick and suffocating. As his anxiety spiked, his asthma kicked in. He kept hitting his inhaler until it completely ran out. By 8:40 p.m., he was visibly struggling to breathe. Around 9 p.m., Chris slid down the wall and sat on the floor. He tried to get back up, but he just didn't have the strength. By 9:40 p.m., he collapsed. It wasn't until 10:02 p.m., nearly 2.5 hours after he was locked in, that a gate agent preparing for a different flight happened to notice movement on the bridge camera. They opened the door and called for help, but it was too late. Chris died at the hospital later that night. The medical report said he died of severe respiratory failure from an asthma attack that just wouldn't stop. He suffocated because his airways closed up. Investigators blamed a mix of corporate laziness, a broken intercom, a hot room, panic, and a massive lack of communication. 2 supervisors got suspended, and airport management suddenly made it a rule to check jet bridges before planes leave. They even fixed the Gate 12 intercom within 2 days. Funny how fast things get fixed after someone dies. What happened to Chris was a terrible failure of communication. But the next story shows what can happen when people ignore a medical emergency happening right in front of them. It was November 3rd, 2013, at a crowded international airport terminal in London, England. Imagine the usual airport chaos, clanging suitcases, loud boarding calls, and that sterile smell of freshly mopped floors. Right in the middle of the afternoon rush, 38-year-old Emeka Okafor was being escorted to a deportation flight. Emeka had spent 7 years in the UK after arriving on a student visa from Nigeria. Over time, his visa expired, and he survived by taking cash jobs around South London, unloading trucks, helping market vendors, and making deliveries. That afternoon, 2 private security officers were assigned to escort him to a flight bound for Lagos. Unlike regular passengers boarding through the terminal, deportees are often driven directly across the airfield to planes parked on remote stands, completely away from the main gates. On paper, the process is tightly controlled and usually uneventful. At 2:30 in the afternoon, Emeka was taken from a holding area and put into a secure airport van. Witnesses said he seemed completely calm during the drive across the airfield, but as the van pulled up to the waiting aircraft, his entire demeanor changed. He became visibly distressed, his eyes locked onto the massive plane parked right ahead of him. You can only imagine the absolute panic crashing down on him in that moment, realizing that 7 years of hard work and his entire life in the UK were about to end in a matter of minutes. The aircraft was an Airbus preparing for departure from a remote stand. Most of the ground servicing had already been completed, and the pushback tug had disconnected and moved away from the aircraft. As part of the normal departure sequence, one of the jet engines had just been started while ground personnel cleared the area. When the van stopped about 100 feet from the plane, the officers opened the door to transfer Emeka for boarding. And that was the exact moment everything took a different turn. As one officer stepped out, Emeka suddenly lunged through the opening and broke free. He sprinted across the open asphalt before either officer could even react. Security immediately gave chase, and nearby ramp workers started yelling warnings. Multiple CCTV cameras caught what happened next, and according to investigators, it looked like Emeka didn't even have a destination. He kept looking over his shoulder at the officers chasing him, completely focused on escaping rather than where he was actually running. Ahead of him sat the Airbus, with one engine running as the crew prepared for departure. Between the plane and a nearby service road, there looked like an open path. Investigators believe Emeka was trying to reach that road to keep running. The problem was, that path cut directly through the engine intake hazard area. This is the part of the story where your stomach just drops. If you work on a tarmac, you know the area around a running jet engine is a literal death zone. But a civilian? They have no idea. Ground workers recognized the danger instantly. Several began waving their arms and screaming at him to stop. One ground crew member later recalled seeing debris and dust moving toward the intake and immediately realizing Emeka was heading into the engine hazard zone. According to the official investigation, he crossed into the marked danger zone while still looking back at the officers behind him. Witnesses saw his clothing begin to flap violently in the massive rush of airflow. He appeared to stumble, trying to regain his footing, but instead of moving away from the engine, he took one more step forward, and that single step proved fatal. Within seconds, the overwhelming suction pulled him off balance and straight into the intake. Ground crews scrambled to radio an emergency, and the pilots immediately initiated an engine shutdown, but there was no time to stop it. The entire horrific incident lasted less than 10 seconds. Airport firefighters and medics rushed to the scene within moments, but the injuries were catastrophic. Emeka was pronounced dead right there on the tarmac. Investigators didn't find anything wrong with the plane or the engine. It was operating completely normally, and all the safety lines on the ground were perfectly up to code. Instead, the investigation focused on how a detainee managed to break free in an active aircraft area in the first place. The final report slammed the escort procedures, noting a massive lack of personnel and zero contingency planning for what to do if someone tried to run. And as usual with these corporate investigations, the rules changed after the tragedy. New regulations came down, demanding more guards and stricter separations between detainees and active aircraft. In the end, Emeka spent 7 years trying to build a life in Britain. But on the day he was supposed to leave, a desperate, panicked attempt to avoid boarding a plane brought him into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The aircraft eventually departed for Lagos later that afternoon. Emeka died because assumptions replaced common sense, and sadly, the next case starts with another assumption that turned an ordinary night shift into a fatal disaster. Before we get to the next case, consider subscribing, because somehow the stories only get worse from here. It was just after midnight on February 7, 2014, at an airport in Malaysia. The rain had stopped, but low mist still hung over the wet runway. Out on that tarmac was 44-year-old Hafiz Karim. He wasn't some rookie. He'd been in airfield operations for 10 years after a stint in the Army. According to his family, Hafiz was one of those old-school guys who was careful to a fault, the kind of guy whose attention to detail probably annoyed the younger staff. But he never cut corners. He had a spotless record, a wife who taught public school, and a 17-year-old son, Paolo. His job that night was a routine inspection of the runway. Now, routine is a dangerous word in aviation. Whenever you hear that a job was routine, that's usually exactly when things are about to go sideways. This runway was 3,000 meters long, and it handled everything. If you were on it, you had to be visible. Hafiz hopped into airfield vehicle number 3, a white pickup with an amber flashing light, and radioed the tower at 12 o'clock in the morning to start his check. 5 minutes later, things got complicated. A cargo plane, an ATR-72, had to divert. It wasn't an emergency, just an unscheduled arrival. Here is where the breakdown happened, and it's a classic, tragic case of people assuming too much. The tower controller knew Hafiz was out there, but assumed he was already clearing the runway. Hafiz never gave an exact location, and the controller never asked. And as I've been looking back at the files, I saw 2 seasoned professionals just guessing instead of checking, all while a massive plane is moving forward. Meanwhile, Hafiz spotted something on the tarmac, perhaps a broken reflector or a stray piece of debris. He stopped his truck right there on the dark asphalt, left his single amber beacon flashing, and stepped out into the night with a flashlight to investigate. Then, at exactly 12:10 a.m., air traffic control cleared the incoming cargo plane to land. Put yourself in the cockpit. The pilots are staring down at a wet, glistening runway. Glare is everywhere, with dozens of intense airport lights bleeding across the pavement. From their view, they aren't scanning the asphalt for a rogue pickup truck. They are locked into their instruments, monitoring their airspeed, checking their alignment, and preparing for the slick braking conditions ahead. In a sea of flashing airfield markers, the truck's lone amber beacon didn't look like a hazard. It blended perfectly into the background noise of the airport grid. And because the truck was completely stationary, right near the center line, there was no lateral movement to trigger the pilot's instincts. It was a fatal optical illusion. Only after the heavy ATR touched down, when the aircraft's powerful landing lights finally cut through the glare, did the crew realize the terrifying truth. That amber light wasn't a runway marker, it was a vehicle. But by then, the aircraft was fully committed to its landing roll, hurtling down the center line too fast to stop and closing the gap in seconds. The crew slammed on the brakes and threw the engines into full reverse, but you cannot negotiate with momentum. The plane plowed into the pickup truck at highway speed, instantly obliterating the left side of the vehicle. The violent impact spun the truck like a top, sending a wall of shredded steel flying through the air. Hafiz, turning toward the deafening roar of the engines a second too late, was struck by the debris and thrown onto the wet pavement. Airport firefighters arrived on the scene in just 4 minutes. The flight crew was badly shaken, but alive. The truck was a mountain of unrecognizable scrap metal, and Hafiz lay unresponsive near the center line. The medical examiner's report was grim: massive internal trauma, a crushed chest, and a torn major artery. When the investigators looked into it, they didn't find any mechanical failures. It was a runway incursion caused entirely by bad communication. The controller thought the truck was leaving. Hafiz thought the runway was protected. No one checked. No charges were ever filed. After the accident, the airport changed the rules, demanding exact GPS-like position reports instead of vague guesses. Hafiz's co-workers started a scholarship fund in his honor. Hafiz's death happened in seconds, but our final story is different. What makes it so disturbing is that the victim knew exactly what was happening and spent hours trapped with no way out. It was June 22, 2017, at an airport in Dubai. Even after sunset, the heat still hung over the cargo apron as crews rushed through their final checks after a delayed shipment put the operation behind schedule. Caught in the middle of all that pressure was Tariq Manzoor. He was 29 years old, from Pakistan, and had been working in Dubai on a labor contract for 2 years. Like so many guys out there, he wasn't doing this for himself. Most of his paycheck went straight back home to support his parents and pay for his younger brother Imran's college tuition in Lahore. Tariq wasn't some careless worker cutting corners. His co-workers knew him as quiet, precise, and sharp. In fact, his contract was ending in just 3 months, and he'd already bought gifts to take home. And personally, it's just devastating to think about how close he was to the finish line. That night, the plane was a dedicated cargo freighter heading to Frankfurt. You have to understand, the cargo deck of a freighter is built for pallets, heavy nets, and metal tie-downs, not human beings. There are no passenger windows, no call buttons, no inside door handles, and absolutely no way to talk to the cockpit once the door is sealed. It is a giant, windowless metal box. Loading started late because a shipment from Bahrain was delayed. At 9:57 p.m., Tariq was sent into the belly of the plane to fix some heavy cargo bags that had shifted. It was an ordinary task, but the timing was terrible. Just a few minutes later, Tariq's supervisor got called away to another plane. At 10:08 p.m., the final sweep of the area was done. But here's the kicker. Nobody did a verbal head count. The crew outside just assumed Tariq had already climbed down the ladder. At 10:10 p.m., the massive cargo door slammed shut, and 11 minutes later, the plane pushed back. This part makes your stomach drop. You've got a team of people right outside, and not one person thinks to ask, "Where is Tariq?" Investigators later found fresh dents and scratch marks on the inside of the cargo door and wall panels. They even found a freight hook lying nearby. Tariq knew immediately what had happened. He beat on that door with everything he had, but between the sealed fuselage, the roaring jet engines, and the distance to the ground crew, nobody heard a thing. His phone record showed he tried to make call after call as the plane taxied away, but none connected. Once that plane lifted off into the sky, the thick metal hull and the altitude killed his signal completely. At 10:47 p.m., the plane departed for Frankfurt with Tariq trapped inside. The flight lasted nearly 7 hours. As the aircraft climbed toward cruising altitude, conditions inside the cargo compartment became increasingly hostile. Although the area remained pressurized, it was never designed to safely accommodate a person for an entire intercontinental flight. Isolated from the crew, exposed to cold temperatures, and trapped in complete darkness, Tariq did everything he could to stay alive. He dragged cargo bags together to create a barrier against the cold metal walls and wrapped himself in spare packing material he found nearby. Phone records showed repeated attempts to unlock his device until shortly after midnight, when all activity completely stopped. Investigators believe he remained conscious for some time, but prolonged exposure, exhaustion, dehydration, and the extreme stress of the situation gradually overwhelmed him. To me, it is terrifying to realize his final moments were spent trapped in total darkness, completely alone, with no way to call for help while the world passed by miles below. At some point during the flight, he lost consciousness and never recovered. When the plane landed in Frankfurt before dawn, the ground crew opened the cargo doors and immediately noticed that several cargo bags had been repositioned. They climbed inside and found Tariq unresponsive near the rear section of the compartment. Paramedics were called, but there was nothing they could do. The autopsy concluded he died from complications related to prolonged exposure after being trapped inside the aircraft for the entire flight. A completely preventable accident blamed on rushed loading and zero headcount checks. To me, this is the most devastating part of the entire story. No one faced criminal charges, but the contractor quietly settled out of court, following the classic corporate playbook of paying off the family, fixing the rulebook, and moving on. The airport finally mandated headcount checks, and Tariq's brother used the settlement money to graduate from college, later finding a receipt among Tariq's things for gifts he never got to deliver.